China's government has reportedly ordered its domestic airlines to stop accepting deliveries of Boeing jets.
Boeing, America's aerospace crown jewel, just waved goodbye to the U.S. untaking tax billions jobs, and what little economic pride was left all in one brutal exit, and guess who's at the center of this industrial heartbreak? Yep, Donald J. Trump, the same guy who promised to bring back jobs, is now throwing a tantrum as Boeing packs up the factory floor. So we have always read that you reap what you sow, and Donald Trump is finally getting a taste of the chaos he planted after years of preaching. About bringing jobs back and restoring American manufacturing, his own policies have come full.
Biggest U.S. exporter. They are responsible for the most in terms of one company export.
Just not in the way he expected. The man who once stood at podiums bashing globalization is now watching one of America's most iconic companies pack its bags and leave the country altogether. Boeing isn't just leaving the table, they're flipping it over on their way out. Trump vaulted back into office with that same old fire and fury, promising to revive America's factories and bully foreign countries into playing fair. He ramped up the trade war like it was a game of Monopoly. Except this wasn't about hotels and rent, this was about real people, real businesses, and real livelihoods. He called it America First. But the result, more like America alone, isolated, overtaxed, and underperforming, and now Boeing. Yes, Boeing has said enough is enough for decades. Boeing was the poster child of American industrial dominance.
Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg, he said that the company needs a more open culture where workers are encouraged to speak up and communicate across divisions.
We are making some significant progress, and we're starting to see really good progress as we ramp production back up is critically important to the recovery of the program.
Fighter jets, commercial airliners, satellites, they didn't just make planes, they made the sky. You'd think that's the kind of company any president would move heaven and earth to protect. But instead, they've been pushed into a corner, and let's be very clear. They didn't jump ship out of greed, they were shoved. Trump's latest move, a threat to slap a 200% tariff on any Boeing aircraft built outside the US, that's not policy, that's a temper tantrum, it's economic punishment disguised as patriotism. Boeing had merely floated the idea of moving part of its manufacturing to Mexico to survive, and Trump reacted like they just torched the Statue of Liberty. But here's the kicker this time. Boeing didn't cave. They didn't sugarcoat CEO Kelly Ortberg. Essentially said, "We're not here to babysit your ego."
Piece of their business is just one part of it.
Okay.
Over a third of their revenue in total comes from government contracts and their defense business, so that's a really...
And this wasn't some dramatic showdown played out on Twitter. This was corporate survival in real time. Ortberg laid out the facts during an earnings call, and it was brutal. China had already blocked delivery of 50 Boeing jets, that's billions. Gone other buyers in Asia were pulling back the cost of materials. Thanks to Trump's tariffs had shot up so high that every plane Boeing built was bleeding cash. Not exactly a winning formula, but what made this moment different was the tone there. Was no begging, no sugarcoating. Ortberg made it painfully clear that Boeing couldn't build planes in the US anymore.
China's government has reportedly ordered its domestic airlines to stop accepting deliveries of Boeing jets and to halt purchases of aircraft.
And stay alive, not with current policy, not with Trump's tariffs strangling them like a vice. And instead of waiting for the White House to show some economic maturity, Boeing made a move. They started reallocating orders to India and Southeast Asia. They showed that global demand doesn't stop just because Washington throws a fit. And let's not forget, this wasn't Boeing's first rodeo. They've weathered safety crises, lawsuits, and supply chain breakdowns. They've had their name dragged through the mud after the 737 MAX crashes, but they always bounce back. What finally broke them? Not bad parts, not design flaws, tariffs. Trump's tariffs, the very thing he swore would bring jobs home, ended up driving one of the most patriotic companies out the door. That leads us right into the second part of this story, where everything really starts falling apart when Trump started. His trade war, the goal was to protect American jobs. Sounds noble on paper, but let's talk about what that actually meant for Boeing. Their supply chain doesn't exist in a vacuum. They rely heavily on imported aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, and rare earth metals, all essential to building modern aircraft. And suddenly, thanks to Trump's trade agenda, the price of those materials jumped by 25 to 30%. Meanwhile, Airbus, Boeing's biggest competitor in Europe, wasn't facing those penalties they had. access to cheaper parts, more stable trade deals, and buyers who weren't worried about last-minute tariff whiplash. So when Boeing's costs went up and their price tags rose with them, international buyers didn't flinch. They just switched vendors, China. Didn't even hesitate, they scrapped orders on 50 jets 50. That's not a dent, that's a crater. And here's the part that stings even more, Boeing warned us. They warned Congress, they warned regulators, they warned the White House for 3 years. They beg for a rethink on tariffs. They explained in plain English that rising costs were making them uncompetitive. But no one listened, because it's always easier to wave a flag and yell, "America first," than to actually understand how global manufacturing works. Now, Trump's whole strategy is unraveling the company that helped put Americans on the moon. The one that built the planes carrying our troops and our presidents is now being driven out of its own country, and it's not just Boeing that's paying the price. It's the machinist in Everett whose grandfather worked on B-7s during World War II. It's the accountant in Charleston who just bought a home because she trusted Boeing's promise to stay local. It's every diner, every tool shop, every school. Funded by Boeing taxes, these aren't just job losses, these are lives being erased, all because Trump thought throwing a tantrum was an economic strategy, all because no one in power could admit that tariffs aren't a one-size-fits-all solution. Boeing's products became too expensive, their raw materials unaffordable, and their buyers impatient in a competitive world. There's no room for policies built on slogans instead of substance. And now Boeing is doing what any bleeding company would do. They're leaving, and the worst part, they tried to make it work, they held on, they built planes at a loss, they waited for Washington to come to its senses, but Trump wasn't interested in reality. He was interested in headlines, and now he's lost Boeing, maybe. That's why he's throwing another tantrum, but tantrums won't bring back 14,000 jobs, they won't fix the supply chain, and they sure as hell won't convince other companies to stay. This is the chaos Trump created. And now he's watching it explode, just like Boeing said it would. Boeing's first warning shot didn't come with a press release or some dramatic announcement. It came with a whisper, a few quiet comments in an internal meeting, a couple of pointed questions on an investor call. But the message was unmistakable. Boeing was preparing to shift part of its production to Mexico. That was early February 2025, just weeks after China blocked delivery of 50 Boeing jets. In response to escalating U.S. tariffs internally, Boeing had been running simulations for months. The numbers weren't pretty. The cost of sourcing materials, especially aluminum and rare earth elements, had gone up by as much as 28% after Trump's revised tariff expansion in January 2025. Something had to give by mid-February. Boeing's internal logistics team had already scoped out 2 potential sites in Querétaro, Mexico, near Bombardier's aerospace footprint. The move wasn't about abandoning the U.S., it was about basic survival. They weren't trying to win headlines, they were trying to not lose billions more in a market where competitors like Airbus were gobbling up international contracts without the handicap of inflated costs. And it's not like Boeing was asking for a handout, they just wanted to operate in a system that didn't punish them for existing. But even the idea of Mexico was enough to set Trump off. The man who'd built his political persona on economic nationalism didn't take kindly to the notion of Boeing planting a flag outside American soil. On March 1, 2025, during a rally in Peoria, Illinois, Trump launched into a tirade calling Boeing executives ungrateful and traitors to American workers. The next day, he posted on Truth Social his preferred digital megaphone threatening to impose a 200% tariff on any Boeing aircraft assembled or even partially built outside the U.S. He called it America's final red line, but Trump clearly underestimated who he was dealing with. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg, a man not exactly known for public drama, made it clear that Boeing wasn't going to be bullied into economic suicide during the company's first quarter earnings call on March 15, 2025. Ortberg didn't mince words, he said, and this is a direct quote, "We are not going to build jets for customers who won't take them, and we are not going to lose money on every aircraft just to satisfy a headline." That wasn't a clapback, that was a corporate declaration of war. Ortberg went further. He said if China no longer wanted Boeing planes, India and Southeast Asia, well, that wasn't posturing. The company had already opened new negotiations with Indigo. Vietjet and Lion Air with contingency contracts on the table by the time Trump was done, tweeting Boeing's Southeast Asia sales team had already rescheduled its entire May calendar to focus on those markets. Meanwhile, Airbus had increased its global deliveries by 12% in Q1, while Boeing was sitting on unsold inventory worth nearly $6. $3 billion due to halted exports and failed tariffs. And here's the real kicker, Trump's tantrum. It had no effect. Investors knew it, Boeing's board knew it. Even some White House insiders were privately telling journalists that the tariff threat was all noise, no teeth. The next major move wasn't a question of if, but when. That when came sooner than anyone expected. On April 22, 2025, Boeing's board of directors voted 9-2 to approve what is now being called the most significant industrial relocation in U.S. history, in a decision that sent shockwaves through Washington. Boeing announced a full exit from U.S. manufacturing all 5 of its remaining domestic production plants in Everett, Washington, Charleston.